Alright, so this video is going to cover distance, midpoint, and missing endpoint. We did this back in our 2D unit in the fall. So I've written the distance formula on the paper. The distance formula is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So in these examples, you're going to be given 2 points. And when you are given those 2 points, you're going to label them. The first one I'm going to label as x1, y1. So that means the second one I'm going to label as x2, y2. Those correspond with these x2, x1, y2, y1 in the formula. So whatever numbers are here, we're going to be plugging them in up above. So for example 1, I'm finding the distance between 0, 1, and 7, 3. So the first thing I want to do is label these points. I'm going to label 0, 1 as x1, y1. And I'm going to label 7, 3 as x2, y2. So I am going to go ahead and rewrite that formula again. Remember, it's a square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And I'm going to show you where we plug all of these different things in. So I start off with that square root, but in my first parentheses, I have x2. So when I look up at the top, I put x2 as 7. So I'm going to start my parentheses with 7 minus my x1 is 0. So I have 7 minus 0 squared plus my y2 here I have as 3 minus my y1 I have as 1 squared. All underneath that square root. I am going to simplify everything inside the square root. So you can either plug this straight into the calculator or do it in pieces like I'm about to. I have the square root of 7 minus 0 just leaves me with 7. And then I still have the squared. Plus 3 minus 1 leaves me with 2, and I have the squared again. Now 7 squared is the same thing as 7 times 7, so I have the square root of 49, plus 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. And the last thing I do is add everything underneath that radical, so I have the square root of 53, and this is your final answer. Now the next example is a little bit different because we have some negatives here in this problem, and that's going to change a couple of things in our formula. I'm still going to go and I'm going to label my points. So I have x1, y1, and then I have x2 and y2. So I did rewrite my formula as a square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And I'm going to start plugging in like I just did on the last example. So for x2, I have 7. So I have 7 minus, and now this is where things kind of get a little weird. I have x1, which is 3 squared plus my y2 is negative 3 minus my y1 is this negative 4. So I am going to write it with parentheses. Now, in these problems, if you ever have something where it's minus a negative, we can actually turn that all into one big plus sign. So I still have the square root of 7 minus 3 squared plus I now have negative 3 plus 4 squared. So I had that minus a negative and it changed to a positive. I keep simplifying. 7 minus 3 gives me 4 squared plus negative 3 plus 4 gives me 1 squared. My 4 squared turns into 16 plus my 1 squared is still 1. I simplify that further. 16 plus 1 gives me 7. So my answer is this full thing, square root of 17. Because this is a little bit of a harder topic, you do have quite a few practice problems to do. Remember, if you have questions, ask your teacher. The next thing we talked about was midpoint formula. This one is easier than distance, but there is a formula to go with this as well. So your formula for this says that we're going to take x1, add it to x2, and divide it by 2. And that's going to be one part of your answer. And then you're going to take y1, add it to y2, divide by 2. That's your other part. So your answers here will be a point. So you will have 2 numbers in your answer. So looking at example 1, we're going to go ahead and label. So I have 2, 5. I'm going to label it as x1, y1. And 3, 10 is going to be x2, y2. So I have rewritten the formula again so you can see where I'm plugging stuff in. So I'm going to take x1 first, which I've labeled as 2, plus my x2 I've labeled as 3 over 2, comma, my y1 I have is 5, plus my y2 I have is 10. So these are the 2 ways that I have the numbers plugged in. I continue simplifying. 2 over 3 gives me 5 over 2, comma, and 5 plus 10 gives me 15 over 2. and you leave your answer just like this. So I do have two numbers technically. I have 5 over 2 and 15 over 2. Your answer is a point, so you are done. Example 2, there are some negatives in this case, so I'm going to go ahead and label my points again. x1, y1, x2, y2. I take my x's, so I have -1 plus my other x is 6 over 2, comma, I take my y's, -3 plus 4 over 2, and I keep simplifying. -1 plus 6 is the same thing as 6 minus 1, so I have 5 over 2, comma, -3 plus 4 is the same thing as 4 minus 3, so I have 1 over 2, and this is your final answer. The last part for this section that we're going to talk about is called missing endpoint. What missing endpoint was we gave you one endpoint, so we gave you a number, comma number, an x and y value. We gave you the midpoint, so same thing, another point, 2 values, and we asked you to find this last endpoint. The way we do this is we see how we go from endpoint 1 to midpoint on the y value, on the x value, and then we repeat that from midpoint to the second endpoint. So the way I'm going to write this is I'm going to take my endpoint, which here in this problem is -6, comma 3. I'm going to then write it on top of my midpoint, which in this problem is -8, comma -5. And I need to ask myself, how do I go from 3 to -5? I know that I'm getting negative, so I subtract, and I actually subtract 8. And then I ask myself, how do I go from -6 to -8? I subtract 2. Now to find that missing endpoint, we're going to repeat the same exact thing. So from -5, I'm going to subtract 8. And from -8, I'm going to subtract 2. So when I do -8 minus 2, that gives me -10. And when I do -5 minus 8, that gives me -13. And -10, -13 is your missing endpoint. I'm going to do one more example just to show it again. So again, we take those points. We take 5, comma, -10, write it on top of -9, comma, 5. To go from -10 to 5, I'm adding 15. To go from 5 to -9, I'm subtracting 14. And I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to subtract 14 from -9. I'm going to add 15 to 5. When I do -9 minus 14, I get -23. And when I do 5 plus 15, I get 20, which means that -2320 is your missing endpoint.